Now, you're talking about this type of, doomsday event in a sense of where we are. If we don't do anything, what does that timeline look like? How many years do you give before we hit this kind of tipping point precipice where we can't go back?
No one has asked me that question. And I don't really focus on that as an answer. I don't really, when I started working on GMOs, no one knew what a GMO was. It was 1996. I didn't know what a GMO was, and they were about to plant a bunch of them where I was living in Iowa. And a lot of the environmental organizations had given up. Greenpeace was saying, that's genes out of the bottle. And I was looking at the strategy, saying, there's no NGO on earth that I can tell that's focused on the health dangers and translating the science into English and debunking the false science of the biotech industries like Monsanto, which is pretty easy to do, in order to drive consumer choice, which is the top of the food chain, which will then influence how many GMOs are introduced, how many are planted, et cetera, et cetera. So I could not convince any NGO to focus on the health dangers. So I wrote a book, Seeds of Deception, focus on the health dangers. And then all of a sudden I was invited by all the different NGOs around the world to speak. And I guessed right in terms of an angle that had traction, that made a difference, that stopped the plans for Monsanto, which was explicit to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds in the world and patent them. So we ended up with about 12 GMO food crops and a tipping point numbers. So when I see this problem with GMO 2.0, I'm looking for solutions. And the solution is so obvious. We have evidence that the dangers are real, but it's so easy to convey that. And we have the scientific argument where we will never lose a debate on this. It was interesting. I was talking to a microbiologist. A friend of mine was helping me try and find some scientists because we need to work with scientists, and I always have for the food side, and it's a little harder for the specialties for microbiologists. So he said, I was talking to a microbiologist, and he's prominent and works at a big, named place. And he said, he wasn't worried about GMO microbes. He was more worried about plants and animals. He said, the replication process is going to just weed out any GM problem because they won't survive. I said, get me his number. So I talked to him for about an hour. And during the conversation, he started off not worried. And by the end of the conversation, he said, you're absolutely right. We should not release any genetically engineered microbes. He said the ones that are being released in the field, they're designed to survive. And that completely nullified his concern, his lack of concern about lack of survival. And then I talked to him about the simple numbers being produced by high school students and that some of them might survive. And then we talked about some other things. And he was totally on board in an hour. Now, he's a microbiologist. I asked a microbiologist who works with us regularly, I said, ask 5 of your friends what they think of genetically engineered microbes and the potential risk. He called them up or emailed them, and they all said the same thing. I hadn't really thought about it. But in an hour, a microbiologist who'd spent decades working with microbes now realizes, OMG, this is a powder keg. Some of the microbiologists that we reached out to said, this is biological dynamite, unquote. So we have the science on our side. We just don't have scientists on our side yet because they haven't thought about it. So we have a job to do. One of the targets we need are scientists, particularly experts. And we need to give them a voice so they're not scared to be defunded and deplatformed by the biotech industry. And I think right now, the investment in the microbes as a genetic engineered industry is a lot less than the plants and animals. We have to uproot millions of acres. We have a window now, which won't be there in 5 or 10 years after all of these biological companies start pumping out GMOs. And then they get to say to the regulators, well, if you make a change, it'll be horrible for the economy, which stops regulators in their tracks.
Yeah. Money
and they'll
talks.
have to wait. They'll have to wait until a catastrophe. See, that's the other option. We can just, build up a thing, not have enough power, a catastrophe happens, and then we say, I told you so. But who wants to do that?
No one wants to do that. It
Right.
impacts everyone in a horrible way. You gave some actionable pieces. Of course, go to Institute for Responsible Technology, IRT, fund that. What can people do in their everyday actions to gain some control back? Of course, we have choices. We are kind of being fed a lot of different information that leads to certain choices by these mass conglomerates, these powerful companies behind everything. But don't we have the choices then to say enough is enough? We won't support them.
Yes. It's more that for GMO 1.0, where our choices in the supermarket are super important
Yeah.
for our own health and for food. Our choices are harder when they're genetically engineering insects, mosquitoes. But
how do you feel about that? The mosquito thing going on right now with Bill Gates and Texas.
I can talk about that in just a second. But let me respond to this very important question about empowering individuals.
Absolutely.
So do sign up for our newsletter, because sometimes we have sign on to this letter to Secretary Vilsack, sign on to this petition, contact, in a quick click and send revolutionary style, send out this thing to your members, your elected officials, share this document with your journalists. So there's things people can do. There's also receiving our information and sharing it on social media. Because again, I don't think consciousness is linear and local and isolated. I think human beings through history have had leaps, that there's changes that happen, and that I think it happens often like a physical system where the number of aligned iron filings can create a magnet. All of a sudden, a phase transition, the number of pacemaker cells in a heart can all of a sudden get the entire system to function that way. I think that we need a critical mass of thinking. And we're running through critical mass shifts quicker than ever before with the social media information. And there's changes, not always in a good direction, but often. And I think that participating as a point of dissemination of this is way more important than people realize, because they're aligning those iron filings, creating a thing where everyone goes, well, it's obvious. We're not at the point where it's obvious, but that'll happen. Where everyone goes, oh, it's obvious we need to protect the microbiome. But right now it's like, nothing's happening. No one's home. So there's that. Then there's individual choice to go above and beyond the click and send revolutionary, above and beyond signing their name. And that is those that are writers, those that are speakers, those that are practitioners in some format, those that have relationships with funders or with people who have tremendous influence. So when people say, what can I do? As they have for 27 years, I say, it depends. What do you do? What do you love to do? Who do you know? And figure out how you want to make a contribution. And don't feel guilty if you can't devote your 100% of your time like I do. That's not your job. But there may be a portfolio of actions that you're using to help the world. Include this in it. And watch the films and read the information so that you're part of that consciousness now aligning and accommodating for this inevitable time in human history where we can end biological evolution as we know it or protect nature. Now, what happens also is, because this is a threat like no other, where a single accident in a high school class can devastate the population, it means we have more power to destroy nature and ourselves than ever before. We have a greater responsibility than ever before, individually. Now, what does that mean? It means that the relationship between us and the microbiome must change. We must be the safeguard, the sentry, the guardian at the gates, not the barbarians at the gates, the guardians at the gates to protect the integrity of nature, not just the microbiome, but gene pool in general. So when that's the case, if we can use this opportunity, this unprecedented risk in terms of the technology, to change our relationship with nature to become the protectors, that affects way more than genetic engineering. Now we have a new mindset. Oh yeah, these are our oceans. This is our atmosphere. This is our rainforest. But it's starting on the level of genetic integrity where the ripple effect is so easy. I mean, invasive species are one thing. 24 rabbits were introduced in 1859 to Australia. By the 1920s, there was over 10 billion because rabbits multiply like rabbits and there weren't natural predators. Everyone gets that. But what about not just an invasive species? What if you replace everything in an ecosystem with something new, genetically engineered? Oh, good. This company's giving us this academic is giving us this. And now you have all invasive species that you cannot even identify that travel around the world. So it'll become obvious. It'll become the duh moment. Everyone will get it. But it requires the clarity of a certain number of individuals for that consciousness to go, oh yeah, that's a problem. And putting it out there on social media, including it in conversations. So that's my answer to that question.